Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jenny Phillip, Chief Strategy and Innovation Officer at the Greater Houston Partnership. Thank you all for joining us. I hope everyone has been staying safe, staying relatively dry, and will continue to do so through the storm. I am excited to have this fourth installment of our webinar series. For those who have been following and those who haven't, the partnership has launched its racial equity initiative, One Houston Together, and part of this is building awareness and knowledge around racial equity issues. So the first webinar series was a conversation, a foundational conversation just about understanding racism. And then the next two were more on specific topics of education and health. Today's webinar will focus on how do we bring this together and discussing those attributes that create and develop an equitable community, and how do we sustain that within Houston. We have a fantastic panel today that we're excited to bring to you. Dr. Robert Bullard, Distinguished Professor of Urban Planning and Environmental Policy at Texas Southern University. Duwain Pinder, Associate Partner at McKinsey and Company, also a co-author of The Racial Wealth Gap. Susan Rogers, Director of the Community Redesign Center at the University of Houston College of Architecture, and our moderator, Kyle Shelton, Deputy Director of the Kinder Institute for Urban Research at Rice University. I'm so thankful for their time today and appreciate everyone who's attending. You are able to ask questions. There will be time at the end, about 10-15 minutes for panelists Q&A from the audience. You can submit those questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And there's also an opportunity to upvote so that we can make sure the more popular questions that are on the minds of the attendees today also get asked. With that, I'll turn it over to Kyle to start off the conversation.
Thanks, Jenny. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Kyle Shelton, the Deputy Director at the Kinder Institute for Urban Research. I'm really excited to be here today and talking with Susan, Duwain, and Bob. So thanks for joining us. Let's start out, Susan, I'll direct this your way. Let's start out kind of trying to set a common definition of what we're talking about when we talk about creating equitable communities. Obviously, it's a big topic and can contain multiple perspectives and angles into it. Can you tell us from your perspective, what do you think some of the most critical components and steps are to build towards greater equity across our neighborhoods and communities? And particularly, I'd ask all of you as we go through, because I want to get a definition from each of you all, how do we really grapple with even bigger picture elements, like making sure when we're talking about equity, we're talking about really meaningful access to power, and also not just dealing with issues today, but grappling with some of the historic roots that have contributed to those equity issues. So Susan, can we start with you?
Right. So I think the first important point is that there are significant historical roots to the inequities that we see in our communities today. And I think it is important to talk about those at some point. I think that in my mind, you know, equitable communities are communities that have access to high quality healthcare, to high quality educational opportunities, to transit that provides mobility and connections to jobs and other resources, that provide high quality, affordable and safe housing, that, you know, have opportunities for healthy living like parks and open spaces. Really all of the things.
It's not sufficient to try to create more equity in outcomes if you're not also creating more equity in voice and more equity in power. Theoretically, that's the way that you get to the equitable outcomes, is by giving the folks who are the most affected an equal voice and to be able to determine what their outcomes look like. And so I think that's, also the way you get to an equitable community is by creating equity in the broader process in order to shape what that looks like.
Thanks, Duwain. Bob, what would you add to that definition, and how would you think about those categories? I think that Duwain just added of outcomes and process. I know we've talked a little bit in the preparation for this, that you voiced that process discussion as well. I'd love to hear your thinking on this.
Well, first of all, I think I agree with everything that's been said. But I think there's another layer when we talk about equitable communities, I think we have to also add justice. Just you can have an equitable outcome, but if the inputs for one group means that you have to work twice as harder to come up with the same results, that is, you might have equity at the end, but I don't think it's just and fair. So when we talk about equitable communities, we have to talk about the elements of fairness, the issues of justice, and then equity. I think it's important to also understand that that in a society that's built on inequity, that's stamped into its DNA 401 years ago, we have to work hard to erase that stain that has developed and that has been perpetuated systemically for these many decades, and it cuts across all systems, whether it's education, housing, employment, transportation, healthcare, voting, etc. And so when we talk about an equitable community, community as a sociological concept is very broad, and there are many sectors, there are many elements that make up community. And so we have to really strive to achieve that North Star of equity and justice for all. And that for all is emphasized, is bold in capital letters.
Thanks, all. I want to ask a couple follow-ups on a few of those. Duwain, can we come back to your idea about the process and sort of that investing in those steps and making sure you're kind of not just identifying what the goals are, but then really following through? Are there examples or sort of steps that you would highlight in trying to create a process like that helps us really create concrete steps and think about how to go through this goal of creating more equitable community?
It's a good question. I mean, I think to me, there's two that come to mind. As I'm sure there are probably others, but I think as Susan and Dr. Bullard said, is these inequities are really based in history and the structures and the systems of how our society is built. And so I think any process to create equitable communities, has to begin with looking and really interrogating, acknowledging our past. I think too many of these initiatives that are focused on creating equitable communities are what I would call present forward. They're like, well, we understand that there's an achievement gap. What can we do to solve it right now? We understand that there's a housing gap. What can we do to solve it right now? We understand that there's a racial wealth gap. What can we do to solve it right now? Without stopping to say, how did these things get created? How did they manifest? How long have they lasted? What systems and structures have continued to accelerate those things? Let's just understand that first before trying to create something new. But I think the second part is, actually putting in power people who have been the most affected. I think too many of these initiatives are led by well-meaning, I would say, folks who may not represent the full breadth and depth of the experiences of the people who have been the most affected. And so the any movement or any push for change that isn't led or driven by the people who are most affected, I think is going to have serious challenges to having broader impact. And so, how do you seek out the voices, put those voices at the center of the conversation, and make sure you're actually listening to those voices? I think those are, to me, two critical steps among, I'm sure, many, but those to me seem to be really important.
Great, thank you. Susan, did I see you wanting to add something there?
Yeah, I think it's such an important point. The work we do at the Community Design Resource Center is kind of founded in how do you kind of, one, collect and listen and collect the voice of people, but also help to create the tools that they can use to further the vision and the ideas that they have for the communities in which they live. I think that oftentimes, I think instead of what Duwain is suggesting, where we create a table that's more equitable, where everyone has a seat. I think we often place the onus on communities themselves to try to fight this fight without a seat at the table. And so I think it's really important for, other groups to kind of recognize the important role that they can play as opening up those seats, as being allies and advocates for the communities who need resources, and be willing to both kind of acknowledge the historical kind of legacy of racism, and that opportunity and access to it is not equal, and being willing to work towards creating systems and policies that can start to kind of unravel that system.
Yeah. I think also in just to add that even when we start planning forward without looking back in terms of past plans and initiatives, for example, the racial redlining that occurred over 100 years ago in the 20s and 30s is now showing up in terms of urban heat islands. The neighborhoods that would redline across the country, including Houston, are the neighborhoods that's the hottest. It's also racial redlining that occurred 100 years ago is showing up in terms of COVID-19 hotspots. The racial redlining that occurred 100 years ago is also showing up in terms of how that redlining was theft, robbery of Black wealth in terms of homeownership. And you're seeing that historical legacy of going forward in terms of the future. If homeownership is the backbone of middle class wealth, and if a population is denied that ownership because of historical legacy and continuing to that particular discrimination in fair housing and other kinds of impediments to mortgages and loans, et cetera, that theft of transformative wealth generations forward is being replicated. And so we have to attack, that historical legacy, and we have to make sure that we don't build on those inequities. When we talk about building out affordable housing, home ownership initiatives in terms of flood protection and dealing with all kinds of climate resilience, we have to understand and not just use the same framework that was assumed to be class neutral and race neutral. Because in many cases, if we don't dissect those policies, another example is cost-benefit analysis after disasters. If we just use strictly cost-benefit analysis and in the Stafford Act, a federal act that deals with disasters and rebuilding and recovery, if we just use cost-benefit analysis, the resources will flow to rebuilding and recovery in those $800,000 homes on the west side, whereas the $80,000 homes on the east side, it takes 10 $80,000 homes to make one home. If you talk about the biggest bang for the buck, the money will flow in this formula. Money follows money, money follows power, and money follows whites. We have to supplement our methodologies and our metrics that we're using so that we are building in an equity lens, a justice lens for corrective. And again, that takes commitment and a transformative change in the minds of those who are in power and decision making.
And Bob, I think that's a great example that I'd like to ask anybody who can weigh in on this a little bit more on the cost benefit. Just, we want to think about these actions and we want to think about identifying some of these steps, as you're saying, Bob, about what it looks like to actually dissect and then respond to the inequities built in previous systems. Can you give us a little bit more detail? And I know some of this work has happened in Harris County to try to grapple with what that previous assessment looked like. What are some of the steps agencies have taken to try to flip that previous analysis and that previous cost benefit formula post Harvey here in Harris County, or that you've seen nationally?
Well, let me give you one example in Houston. post-Harvey. And it took a biblical flood to get 3 dozen organizations to come together to work on issues around environment, equity, resilience, flooding, air pollution, et cetera. Environmental justice, economic justice, to put it, and climate justice, put it bluntly. And our organizations came together, and we said that we have to SEER, Coalition for Environment, Equity, and Resilience. This is a brand new organization. It was only came together after Harvey. People had to put aside their own little differences and nuances and priorities and come together and say, we need to do something. And one of the first things that we said we needed is for Harris County to think differently and to talk about how can all communities receive equal protection and to address this in a way that had not been addressed before. And so we developed this equity framework and presented it to the Harris County Commissioners Court, and they looked at it, they voted on it, and they approved it. In other words, all the monies and resources coming down to Houston Harris County needed to be looked at in terms of an equity lens, so that we don't rebuild on inequity. Because before Harvey, Houston and Harris County is very unequal. And so if we are to allow the same framework and policies to go forward, we will actually again build on inequity, and you'll still see those communities that were hardest hit and that was left behind before Harvey, economically, as well as land use and amenities, et cetera, will lose out much more. And there's a study that was done that showed that after recovery dollars have been sent to areas that had $10 billion plus severe weather events, on average, white communities gain an average of $126,000, whereas communities of color lost about $29,000, almost $30,000. And so disasters will widen the economic and the racial wealth gap. So we have to make sure that we don't fall into that trap of doing it business as usual. We have to think outside of the box, and we have to put equity at the center and at the core. Now, this is very different for a city like Houston that's market driven, and you let the market drive everything and assume that everything will fall as they fall, and they do fall as they fall, which is very unequal.
Thanks, Bob. That's a great description of a very specific shift in the existing process to really start down the path of reinventing what equity can look like, and with that very large fund of dollars coming from the Harvey recovery, that's a really critical change to be seen here in Harris County. Bob has touched on the racial wealth gap a couple times, and Duwain, I want to turn to you because I know you've done some work and research in your role at McKinsey looking at the wealth gap in particular. And one of the big conclusions you found is that closing the racial wealth gap can actually increase the gross domestic product significantly. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that study. Can you start again in the spirit of level setting, making sure we're all
Sure.
talking about the same ideas? Can you kind of describe what the wealth gap is, what you see some of the main factors as, and I know we've already touched on some of this. And then I think particularly maybe to ask you as well, what is a group like McKinsey, why is a group like McKinsey looking at a topic like the racial wealth gap?
Yeah. So maybe we just start off the difference between income and wealth. And income is, the paycheck that you receive from your place of employment or through the gains that you make through entrepreneurial activities. But it's really the, monthly, annual income versus wealth really encompasses not only the income, but also just the assets that you and your family have, your house, your bank accounts, your investments in the broader market. All of those things are in wealth. And it's not surprising that if you have a group of people that were originally thought as assets and are now being conceptualized as real human beings, that there's actually a significant gap between the actual assets that Black folks have relative to white folks. And when this last looked, white folks had on average about $171,000 in assets. versus Black folks only had 17,000, so a gap of about 10 times. And the folks in academia and the nonprofit and social sectors have been talking about the racial wealth gap for generations, and how important it is, and how it really depresses overall economic mobility for Black Americans, decreases the ability to take risks and start entrepreneurial ventures. And so there really has always been a moral and social case for decreasing the racial wealth gap. The challenge has been, I think the private sector often does not react to moral and social claims. They always ask the question of what is the economic justification. And so what we did in our paper was we said, true that there is a racial wealth gap, but let's understand what the impact could be if we close that racial wealth gap on the broader economy. What would it look like for the investments that would be made, the increase in consumption, the overall acceleration of the broader economy? And what we found is that if you close the racial wealth gap, based on some basic assumptions, there would be a significant increase in GDP on the tune of $1 to $1.5 trillion each year, 4 to 6%, a massive economic expansion by just really focusing on this topic of racial equity. And so, the impetus it really has been, and we're starting to hear this from our clients, is, the world continues and our society continues to be really unequal. There is a groundswell of energy to try to solve that inequity. And there is an increased impetus for the people involved in solving that inequity to not just be the public sector, to not just be the social sector, but for the private sector to have a real role in addressing that. Because if we talk about some of the things that we were talking about before, the private sector has had a significant role in playing and actually creating some of these inequities. If you think about slavery was a private sector private sector enterprise. A lot of the principles of managing slaves, et cetera, are private sector principles that were applied in a really devastating way to a specific community. So the question that we're trying to ask is, what is the private sector's role in addressing some of these inequities, not just to help the broader Black community, but really to accelerate and kickstart the broader U.S. economy.
Great, thanks, Duwain. Bob, we've touched on several of the historic roots of inequities in Houston, and you've chronicled those inequities and the struggles to overcome them for decades in several of your great books and really powerful work. Are there other elements aside from, you've already touched on redlining, we've talked about sort of resilience and infrastructure a bit. Are there other elements that you would add to the discussion to help us understand the roots of some of the inequities in Houston? Are there critical pieces that we haven't discussed yet, either policies or just general historic practices that we really see and you continue to see us grapple with today in Houston and Harris County?
Well, I think it's important to really understand that the racial footprint in Houston has endured. And even though Jim Crow segregation was outlawed in 1954, we still have a racialized place that oftentimes will dictate opportunity. If you look at zip code, it's still the best predictor of health and well-being in our country, and including Houston. And in addition to racial segregation, we also have income segregation. And if you look at the increasing number of high income let's go census tract, is increasing, as well as the high percentage of census tracts that's inhabited largely by low income. So you get this segmentation by income and by race. And if you talk about which communities are most likely to get those things that make communities healthy, you can overlay that footprint of income and race and say who has the best parks, who has best access to the kinds of things that make you healthy, grocery stores and walk trails and farmers markets and all those things we know that planners know, that you can plan for for healthy and resilient communities, oftentimes those communities that historically have been left out are still being left out. And so what we have to do is put a layer, an equity justice layer on top of our city, and talk about how we're going to correct those things, correct the food deserts, correct the access to good, affordable, clean, efficient public transportation, access to healthcare. We have the world's largest medical center, but it could be located on the moon for a lot of communities who don't have insurance and who don't have access to cars to get to whatever. So we have to somehow unpack the inequality and the inequity that's generated by policy, but also generated by space and racialized place. And who gets the landfill, who gets the incinerator, who gets the chemical plant, who gets who gets flooded every year after year after year. And so those kinds of things that we have to, the built environment, the social environment, and the environment, which the political environment in which we make policies and make decisions. All those things have to come together. And I tell my students the word for the day when we talk about this stuff is intersectionality, how things connect. And if we're going to address it in a holistic way, we have to really show how things connect.
Mm-hmm. And I think that echoes nicely what Duwain was saying as well, that it's not just the public agency's responsibility, but also private industry and private actors having to think about those decisions and apply that same equity lens to their actions and how they interact with the public agencies. Susan, I want to follow up with you and the work of the Community Design Resource Center. You guys you really take an innovative and empowering approach to working with communities. And I'm curious, with some of the context that we've talked about now and these challenges that we're seeing, mostly for Black and brown communities, tell us a little bit more about the process you all at CDRC go through with communities when you're talking about planning and what needs and challenges they're trying to address and what strengths they're trying to build on. And how are you all seeing some of these obstacles manifest in that work and working with residents to try to identify strategies to address them?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a big question. I'm going to try to pick a little bit of it. So, I mean, typically in our partnerships with community organizations and community members and residents, we always start by really trying to understand that place in a really deep way and sharing that information with our partners. We think it's really important to have data, for communities to have data that they can use to both kind of understand what the challenges are and work to address them. I would say, like, so there's two things that are happening. One, I'm incredibly inspired by the number of young people who are wanting to return to places like Kashmir Gardens and Sunnyside, and they have great jobs and great professions. They want to be entrepreneurs. I think, they want to build new economies, economies built in the Black community. And I find that so incredibly inspiring. And I realize the kind of barriers that they're up against and kind of, seeing that through, though I have every hope that this will in fact happen. I think on the other side, the concentration of wealth in our nation at the very top is limiting social mobility. So this idea that we kind of all, if we just work hard, we can make it, is becoming less and less true. And I think, the concentration of wealth at the same time that we're experiencing this incredibly disruptive pandemic, I think that is starving public coffers of the resources that they need to make up for some of the market failures that ensure that some neighborhoods don't have access to the resources. So I think those two things are kind of happening simultaneously. And I think, I'm inspired by, new kind of models for investing and cooperatives and investing and small entrepreneurs. But I think we need more of that, because I think we have to find a new way to ground an economy that's local and rooted to place and to the people who live there.
Thanks, Susan. And I think actually that leads into a bigger question that I'll bring us towards the end of our conversation, and then we'll open up to Q&A. One of the things that just jumped out to me from your comments, Susan, you mentioned that municipal budgets are going to get crunched and public budgets are going to get crunched right now. And we're just starting to sort of see that in these previous few weeks and months as governments are announcing their incomes and what they're bringing in from taxation and how that's going to change. I also think Houston is in a really unique, not exclusive relationship with philanthropy, but we have a very strong relationship with philanthropy and with private funding, trying to address some of the gaps that we see in our region. I'm also wondering if you all have thoughts on how we go below how we push and encourage that philanthropy to team with the public funding and to really go beyond sort of the Band-Aid approach of we see this as a major issue right now and we're going to put some funding towards that and push towards what we've been talking about more in the systemic change mindset. How do we encourage that private-public funding partnership to move towards some of what you all have laid out as our big challenges? Just another really small question. I'm good at asking really easy bite-sized questions.
Yeah, let me take a first stab. I think it's important that that we create those long-standing relationships with public-private funding sources, so that it is seen less than funding a project and more in terms of investing. And when we talk about investing in infrastructure, we also need to invest in social infrastructure and social networks, so that when we have some type of disruption, whether it be a pandemic or whether it be a severe weather event or some other type of catastrophe, that the physical infrastructure may somehow be damaged to the level that at some point it will demand billions to repair. But if we have a resilient social network infrastructure that can also withstand these disruptions, it'll make it easier to rebound. And what we've seen in the past is that there has been underfunding of our social networks and social infrastructure, so that when these disruptions happen, our communities are scattered to the four winds, and in many cases, non-government organizations, nonprofits go under, or basically have to leave the city or whatever, or somehow sent to different places, and some can't come back physically and some can't come back in terms of their leadership. So it makes a whole lot of sense if we are to invest in those social networks and that social infrastructure, and plan for these common disasters, and they will keep coming, and climate change will exacerbate these inequities, so that we need to plan for this climate resilience. And if we harden our levees and dams and reservoirs and freeways and whatever, we need to do the same level of priority to hardening our social networks and our social infrastructure. Now I'm speaking as a sociologist, and I'm speaking as someone who has worked on this stuff for 40 years and worked directly with Katrina, but Harvey was the first time that I had to evacuate. So it's from research and from data, but also from firsthand experience. We need those investments made, those public-private partnerships, community university partnerships, to make those kinds of collaborations.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I'm reflecting on a few things that could be potentially be helpful as we think about the mindset of investing. The first is you know, if you just take something like the racial wealth gap or just racial inequity, built over the course of 400 years, with the full weight of society kind of pushing in all directions to support this inequity, right? And so if that's the case, then like what is it going to take in order to shift that trajectory? You know, number one, it's not going to be solved by like, you know, funders and philanthropic organizations and private sector organizations coming together for 1 year, doing something big, and then that's it, right? Like, it's going to take real sustained effort that's moving faster and stronger than the current direction of racial inequity. And so, you know, look, what I've seen is a lot of corporate, really interesting, nice statements in the wake of George Floyd, you know, pledging, you know, in some senses, like pennies on the dollar relative to their overall budgets. And, you know, I think that's nice, but it's inadequate, I would say. So that's like the first thought. The second thought is so like the sustained effort is the first thought. The second thought is really around, you know, operating from all of the sectors, you know, like clear collaboration and clear moving in the right direction from all sectors, not people kind of working in their silos. And so I think being able to take a holistic and systemic viewpoint, you know, I think is also important. You know, I think the other thing that comes to mind is just this recognition that, you know, you can take backward steps, right? So like if you were to take racial inequity pre-COVID-19, I think we are wholly in a different place and in a worse place post-COVID-19. You look at every single metric of like education, Black folks are more likely to be in communities that don't have broadband, that are less likely to log into online education, that are less likely to be able to have access to a school that has the relevant safety protocols. If you just take like from a future income earning potential, Black children are already being set back. You know, Dr. Bullard already talked about how Black communities have been significantly ravaged by just the loss of life. The loss of life is not just a loss of life from a health perspective, which is devastating, but it's also loss of income and of economic stability. So if you think about the people who are being evicted and are not having access to food, et cetera, all of those people are more likely to be Black and brown folks. And so just like the ongoing COVID-19 crisis is continually setting us back relative to where we were at. So like even saying, let's get to a February 2020 lens of racial inequality would take a massive amount of work just to get back to where we were, you know, 6 to 7 months ago. And so I like what I'm not hearing is that like urgency, right? If people really understood how much of a step back we're making and how important racial equity is theoretically, you would see a significant mobilization from all sectors to actually make an impact. But we're not really seeing that. And that either speaks to people, A, don't understand the problem and haven't conceptualized it, or B, they understand it, but it's not as important as other things. And so, you know, both of those answers are not sufficient if we actually want to make progress in a meaningful way.
And Susan, I want to offer you the chance to respond too. Before I do that, Jenny, I'm just going to flag for you that I'm going to come to audience questions after Susan.
Great. I think this is such an important discussion. And Duwain, your comment about, you know, is it that people don't know? Is it that people don't understand, like the mountains that I sometimes I'm curious about that. You know, we're working in Fifth Ward right now. And so we looked at median household income by race, 23,000 a year, median household income in 2018 for Black families, 103,000 for white families who live in Fifth Ward. Kashmir Gardens has a life expectancy of 68 years, a full 12 years less than Harris County overall. Black homeownership in the city of Houston is at its lowest level since 1995. I think that, the disparity that we have across race in our city, in our country, is just incredible. And COVID, again, yeah, we know, but we don't have the numbers in front of us, Duwain. But we know if you're in communities, if you're seeing what's happening, the disparities of the impacts of COVID-19 are great. I needed to reinforce that, because I think part of what we need to do is really understand the system that we've created and the barriers that exist in that system to get us towards an equitable community.
Thanks, all. And I was just going to echo too. I think one thing that Bob brought up is that, COVID is sort of a national experience, right? And we're confronting those challenges all throughout the country and the world. And then we get even more localized shocks and stresses that change the circumstance, right? So we're in no way static, right? So I think, Duwain, to your point, you're not just solving for February 2020. Now you're solving for COVID, and, we're sitting in Tropical Storm Beta, and who knows what that creates complications for people today. So it has to be iterative. So thank you all for those comments. I think we're going to open up. Jenny's going to help us come through some of the questions from the audience, and we'll see what we have. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks everyone. There's been, the top two questions are related, and it's really about understanding what examples are there that come to mind of an equitable community prototype anywhere in our city or beyond. Are there examples of cities successfully improving communities by reallocating resources or funds from certain services to others? There was also another question on looking at what do you prioritize? Is it health? Is it housing? Is it education? Right? And so I think if we can kind of go around, let me see. Everybody looks like they're thinking, so I'll go with Susan. You look prepared to jump in already, so we'll go with that.
Well, so we have been involved in the Mayor Turner's Complete Communities Initiative, an attempt to try to address some of the historical public kind of inequitable public investment, but also private investment in those neighborhoods and what we can do about it. I think that, and I think this issue of investment is really important. I wanted actually to respond to Duwain's idea, because I think that, both in terms of philanthropy, in terms of the public sector, in terms of, banks and other investors, like we need, new models that are emerging in some of our communities to be supported. I think we have to find ways to, and I think this is where, Dr. Bullard's comment about thinking outside the box, I think we have to find ways to get money in these places to support the people who are, reimagining a future, and maybe bypass some of the, the kind of typical systems that typically are taking money off the top along the way. I think it's a really difficult question, and I don't have an example of an equitable community in the United States. Yes.
Yeah, Dr. Bullard.
Let me just say for the record, there is no model in this country because systemic racism is everywhere in this country, and in some places it's more potent than in other places. So there are some places that have taken the initiative and have owned up to racism as a health problem. For example, in Boston Health Department has basically declared racism as a public health issue, and has started to move its initiatives around dealing with the issues that in terms of outcomes, in terms of stress, mental health, in terms of access to healthcare, et cetera. Now that's just one area. When I lived in Atlanta, we had a very forward-thinking county commissioner, Emma Darnell, and she represented the South Fulton County, and she wanted, and most of the environmental hazards and threats and facilities were located on the south part of the southern part of the county. And so she wanted to get her other colleagues on the county commission to pass an equity ordinance to deal with environmental justice and facility siting and land use, et cetera. And she persuaded the county commissioners to pass that ordinance. And I was over a center in Atlanta, and we helped write that ordinance and to get it passed through the county. And it was placed in the county health department in terms of a healthy people and healthy environment. It takes initiatives, and there are other kinds, like the state of North Carolina, New Jersey. New Jersey just passed the most forward-thinking environmental justice act that's looking at cumulative impacts of pollution on communities and public health. Now, that's the only state in the country that has done that. Looking at not just one particular health threat, but looking at the cumulative impact of what's happening in communities and how all of this stuff that's being dumped on communities into the air, into the ground, et cetera. And then that state law is to get implemented in those local hot spots, those environmental sacrifice zones that we call them, those areas that have that are overpolluted. Those are the kinds of things that will take leadership. And again, we have 50 states and only one state has done that. And so we can talk about other kinds of things, but when you identify the problem, you get the research to have the data to back it up, and then the next part is to get the political will to say we're going to do something about it legislatively, or at a state level, or at a county level. Now that's what we are missing in a lot of ways in terms of getting the right kinds of formula for success. As I said, there's no cookie cutter, but Texas is different, Houston is different. So we have to do it in a way that will be, in some cases, unique to this area, but we can borrow from other places, and where it can be adapted, I think that's where we need to try to move on it.
Yeah. And just quickly, two thoughts, just completely underlined. There is no model, and it's a sad statement of our society that you can't point to one, but I think it's the accurate statement. I think the other thought though is on this question of like, is it health? Is it education? Is it economic development? I would say the answer is yes, right? Just if you put a private sector lens on some of these things, and this is conversations we're having with our clients, the private sector, I think, enters this conversation, which is, okay, racial equity. So I need a couple more Black people in my employee lens. I need to try to hire a chief diversity officer. I need to, increase the number of people on my board. All those things I think are important, but I think they're not sufficient. And so I think if you took a lens of, every single system in our society is implicated and or accelerated racial inequity. Therefore, every single system and organization is going to need to play an active role in pushing against it. Therefore, the question should be for, if you're a bank, what is your strategy to decrease the racial disparities that is in the financial services system? If you are a healthcare provider, what is your strategy for decreasing the health disparities in your communities or the communities that you operate? Is not sufficient to not have an answer. It's not sufficient to say, oh, we have this philanthropic thing that we're doing, or we hired a chief diversity officer and they're going to help us get more Black people. You need to embed it in the way that your organization actually operates. You need to have meaningful goals, and that is something you need to answer for in the same way that you answer for your profits, your quarterly profits on a regular basis to your shareholders. That's the only way, at least I see, that the private sector is actually going to make meaningful gains. Otherwise, it's just going to be marketing and flash in the pan. It's not actually going to make any meaningful difference.
Yeah. And I see Susan nodding vigorously on that. And I'll turn to you quickly on that, but there is a question that relates to that. So, what is the role of elected officials in helping to create equitable communities? How can developers be incentivized to build an equitable way? Duwain, you gave very specific examples for specific industries, and then also principally what should be thought about in terms of what is not only necessary but also sufficient. But Susan and Dr. Bullard, to continue on that thread that Duwain started, and also that some of the audience members asked, let's look at kind of the lens through the elected official side, developers, and any other stakeholders that you would consider adding. Susan? Or Dr. Bullard, do you look like actually here? Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to just say that quickly that I think government has a major role, an important role in leveraging and in working with its corporate partners in making sure that if you have an equitable, just society, it's profitable for everybody. It's profitable from the standpoint of having good health and having good quality schools, making sure that the air that we breathe is of good quality. And when you talk about the things that those of us who have worked on this stuff called justice for decades, there's no downside. If you're talking about having more and more people whose incomes are rising and they're living a better health and a better quality of life, they have people are working every day. It's hard to rob and stick up if you are working every day and doing what you need to do. But if you got a lot of time on your hand and you're idle, I mean that's a potential for unhealthy community. And so building a healthy, just, sustainable community, the bottom line is that it's good for all, for the business community, for the government sector, and for nonprofits, and for folks who are families who are raising their children. That to me is like what we should all be striving for, and it's not just something that can be just outsourced. We all have a part to play.
Yeah, and if I think I could add to that just a little bit, I think, at the elected official level, there is an opportunity to understand how are we making decisions right now about where our money is being spent, and how should we use, as Dr. Bullard has pointed out, a kind of equity and justice lens to make adjustments to those investments in relationship to particularly public services. I think that there's a lot of interesting models emerging around that. I don't know how impactful they have been. The We Budget LA model that is trying to create a participatory budgetary system where stakeholders and residents can input on the city budget and what their priorities are for spending. I think one of the most profound things we heard through the work with communities recently was the desire for some community members and leaders to say, let's rethink some investments in social services instead of sending police to address sex trafficking and substance abuse and things like that. Like, why don't we send social workers? And I think this is becoming fairly common now, kind of around the United States. I think that our elected officials, are controlling the purse strings of our public dollars. And I think both understanding, I'm a little less fond of the public-private partnership. It came out of the 1970s, new federalism, this kind of idea that the public money should follow private money. And I think what's happening in Houston is too often that's actually leading to additional inequity in investment instead of solving a problem where the public is, investing somewhere where the private sector will not. So, and I think we need to look at that really clearly and understand it.
Yeah, but that brings me to a question that Bruce Bush had posed. I'm struggling with reconciling to a solution where if money follows, money, power, and whites, how do we get to an integrated community but avoid gentrification? such as having a community attractive for those that have left to come back and stay, but yet remain affordable for non-whites, less privileged communities, which results in a more equitable allocation of resources.
I'd like to say something. I think this ties back into the development question, the issue of gentrification. I've said this many times over the last couple of years, but gentrification started as a fairly never a nice process, but maybe a little bit nicer in the sense that people would buy an old home, they'd fix it up, move into a neighborhood that potentially they didn't belong in, that was had lower incomes. Today, it is a completely different system. It is no longer this home by home by home kind of slow transformation over decades. It is wide and sweeping change where blocks of historic building fabric are being erased to put up a 8-story apartment complex that will be incredibly lucrative for 15 years, and then I don't know what will happen to it. So I think that there's and much of that's because it's at the global capital level. It's not even local investment, which if you look historically at gentrification, that's kind of where it started. It was local people moving into other neighborhoods. Now it's a global investment strategy. It has a formula, and I think that we have to understand the culture, the memories, the history that are embedded in these places that are being kind of considered just for their investment potential, and how important that is to us as human beings, and try to put a little bit more of our value system back into our humanity, in my mind.
And Jenny, I was going to go back to the public officials question to tie it here too, because one thing I think is really critical to acknowledge with elected officials is that they're setting the regulatory environment within which private actors are acting. And so that is a lever that they have where when they do install certain incentives or requirements, or say, if you're building in these ways, we're putting in these programs that require you to do X, Y, and Z. And so that's also just something I think we have to acknowledge, that they have funding, absolutely, and they're also setting the containers within which we can ask private actors and require private actors to meet certain outcomes and expectations.
Yes, I was going to say, ironically, the cover of Invisible Houston is row houses in the 4th Ward. When I wrote that book in 1987, that community doesn't exist anymore. Freemanstown, 4th Ward, and the accelerator for that gentrification of that area was a city act, the sale of Allen Parkway Village, which was a public housing development, 37 acres. And we said, as Allen Parkway goes, so goes the 4th Ward. So the government can be a big player if it has the will to talk about mixed-use housing, affordable housing, and maintenance of historical emphasis in terms of the area, not just knocking it down and building new. Houston is well known for not really have this this whole idea of history. We like new. Emancipation Park in 3rd Ward, beautiful park now, has been renovated and done, well done. And you look at the houses that are new houses that are coming up, being built around that. None of the incumbent residents can afford any of those houses. So the park itself, that was basically parks that were built brick by slaves, former slaves, and the idea that this neighborhood is undergoing tremendous gentrification and accelerated because it's close in. And I tell the neighborhoods that I work with, the residents I work with, if you can stand on your front porch and see downtown, your neighborhood is a potential for gentrification. And again, just like Susan said, now it's more, it's a plan that's driven by market, driven by forces, not just one homeowner going in and say, oh, I like this neighborhood. And so we have to talk about how can government be a player, since a lot of the infrastructure is built with tax dollars, and the infrastructure can be an accelerator for the gentrification that we're talking about. And whether it's a light rail line and the alignment of the line and the houses, the homeowners, and then the property values and et cetera, all go into how can you maintain the integrity of a neighborhood, and at the same time, the historical importance of those neighborhoods, and also trying to maintain some semblance of incumbent residents who want to stay if they are homeowners, and if there's other kinds of rental units, to make them also mixed use and affordable for people who may not be able to pay $1,500 for a one-bedroom apartment. I mean, and that happened in New Orleans after Katrina, but we didn't have a Katrina here in Houston. We had an economic tsunami that's pushing up the price of housing, and right now, affordable housing. We're not just talking about low-income housing, we're talking moderate.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Bullard. Duwain, I know it's hard to follow that, but was there anything you wanted to add before we close out? Yeah.
Just briefly, I would just say that, like, typically my experience has been, it's not been that the money goes into communities, therefore, diverse or quote unquote white communities therefore come in. It is usually white communities get interested in a community, and then therefore the money starts to flow in. And so I would just be interested in a world where we actually just looked at Black communities and just started flowing money into those communities and investing in the infrastructure in those communities, regardless of whether there's inflow of potential like a young higher income of white residents. And what would that look like? And I'm sure that if that world happens, there would be less gentrification.
Yeah. Well, thank you. On that note, thank you for this incredible conversation. There's been a lot that I know from the partnership side. I'm sure many of our members who are listening are having to think through, for the elected officials who've been tuning in as well, things to think through there. So thank you all for your participation and for sharing those incredible insights and thoughts. Our last webinar in this series is next Tuesday, where we will talk about what the business community's role and responsibility is in addressing racial equity and justice. And obviously many of the themes and discussions that were brought up today will need to carry over to next Tuesday. So thank you for that conversation. Also, I wanted to bring everyone's attention that the YMCA of Houston has launched their Equity Innovation Center, and part of that is they are conducting a freedom tour. I'm going to include a link to that event that you can sign up for. It actually kicks off in 1 hour today, but it is recorded. You can catch it later. It's a 3-part series where the first session today is actually taking a tour around Houston and learning about the local civil rights movement in Houston. Then on the 24th, we'll do a virtual visit to Alabama and understand the civil rights movement as it impacted the nation. And then finally, on September 26th, there'll be a conversation on understanding systemic racism through the US. So I hope that you guys can be a part of that. There are incredible resources that are available now. And so we just hope that the conversations that we're having today resonate in your relationships, through your friendships, your family, and also through your workplaces. Thank you all for joining. Have a great rest of your day.